He thought it was just another taxi call on a frozen night. But the sound he heard next was not meant for human ears. A wounded K9, a sealed military facility, and a dog fighting not to attack, but to survive. When a retired Navy SEAL stepped forward, the entire base froze, because some symbols should never exist unless the truth must surface. This is not just a story about war or dogs. It's about faith, loyalty, and the quiet miracles sent by God. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter grips Minneapolis in a hard, colorless silence where headlights cut through ice-bright streets and every breath feels borrowed. Michael Carter had learned to survive nights by keeping his mind occupied. Traffic lights, street names, engine noise, small, predictable things that stayed in their lanes. At 45, he drove a taxi, not because he loved the job, but because motion kept the past from catching up too quickly. Stillness was dangerous, silence even more so. Silence had a way of turning into voices that didn't ask permission. The radio cracked with a routine dispatch, suburban pickup, no priority code, no sense of urgency. Michael acknowledged it without emotion, guiding the taxi away from downtown and into the outer veins of the city where warehouses gave way to fenced compounds and snow piled higher along the shoulders. Beside him, Rex adjusted slightly in the passenger seat. The dog didn't whine or fidget. Rex never did. There was a calm alertness in the way Rex watched the road, as if every mile carried information worth storing. Michael trusted that instinct more than he trusted his own. The address resolved into a guarded facility set back from the main road, floodlights washing the snow in pale white. A sign near the gate identified it as a K9 Training and Handling Center. Michael slowed, irritation brushing his thoughts. Dispatch hadn't mentioned anything like this. The guard checked his ID, glanced once at Rex, then waved him through. The gate opened with a slow, mechanical groan that tugged unexpectedly at Michael's memory, echoing the sound of heavy doors sealing behind armored vehicles long ago. Inside the compound, the air felt wrong, too orderly, too quiet. Michael parked where directed and was told to wait inside until his passenger was ready. He shut off the engine, and the sudden absence of vibration left his hands feeling empty. He was reaching for his coffee when the sound came, low, rough, pressed tight with restraint. A growl, but not the kind meant to threaten. It carried weight, pain, the kind of sound made by something cornered and unwilling to surrender. Rex reacted instantly, ears forward, body still, eyes fixed on the corridor leading deeper into the facility. Michael felt the growl register somewhere below thought, striking the same place old radio static used to live, the place that woke him at night, when dreams turned tactical. He told himself it wasn't his business. He was just a driver, a civilian now. That word still felt foreign. The growl came again, followed by hurried voices and the sharp clatter of metal hitting the floor. Michael stood before he'd fully decided to. His reflection in the waiting room glass looked older than he felt and younger than he should have. The faded beret on his head hadn't been planned. He rarely wore it anymore, but the cold had cut deeper tonight, and habit had filled the gap. Rex didn't move when Michael stepped into the hallway, but the dog's attention never left him, waiting, always waiting. The medical bay door was ajar. Inside, movement snapped into patterns Michael recognized too well, controlled urgency, people trying to sound calm while time leaked out. Against the far wall, a Belgian Malinois braced itself low, injured leg tucked awkwardly, eyes tracking every motion with unnerving precision. The dog wasn't thrashing or lunging blindly. It was thinking, measuring distances, anticipating hands before they reached it. Someone spoke the word sedation, and the dog's growl deepened, vibrating with warning rather than rage. Michael stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't announce himself. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to. The dog's gaze locked onto him immediately, sharp and searching. Michael felt the familiar internal shift, the one that aligned posture with intent, breath with awareness. His body remembered how to be still without being weak. Behind him, Rex sat, silent, presence heavy and deliberate. A handler told Michael the area was restricted. Michael nodded once, eyes never leaving the dog. "I'll wait here," he said quietly. The Malinois shifted its weight, not retreating, not advancing, simply adjusting. Michael recognized it as a pause, a recalculation, the smallest opening. He felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This wasn't a dangerous animal losing control. This was a soldier who didn't know who to trust anymore. The room seemed to slow around that realization. Voices lowered. Movements became more cautious. The growl softened, losing its edge. Michael thought of the taxi cooling outside, of snow-packed streets and red lights stretching long and patient into the night. He thought of all the miles he'd driven trying to outrun memories that refused to stay behind him. The dog's breathing steadied just enough to notice. For the first time since Michael arrived, the Malinois stopped trying to escape. It listened. And Michael understood with unsettling clarity that this call, this ordinary fare, had already crossed into territory he could never ignore. The medical wing settles into a strained hush, fluorescent lights humming softly as snow presses against reinforced windows, and the night waits beyond the perimeter fence. Michael Carter remained where he was, just inside the threshold, aware that the room had not relaxed so much as recalibrated around him. He felt it in the way voices dropped an octave, in the careful choreography of hands that now moved slower near the injured K9, in the subtle but unmistakable shift from authority to assessment. This was familiar terrain, the kind where rank mattered less than presence, and presence was something Michael had spent years trying to forget. The dog's attention stayed on him, not fixed, not pleading, simply aware, as if cataloging a variable it had not expected to encounter tonight. Michael focused on his breathing, counting the space between inhales, grounding himself in the dull ache of old injuries and the weight of winter boots on tile. He told himself again that he was only here because of a fare, because a dispatcher had pressed a button somewhere in the city and fate had answered with indifference. He did not believe it. A young man in fatigues stepped closer, his role obvious from the way others deferred just slightly when he spoke. He was a SEAL, newly assigned by the look of his posture and the tension he carried like a pressed uniform inside his chest. His gaze drifted past Michael's face and stopped abruptly at the beret. The pause was so sharp it cut the air. The young SEAL's expression changed, disbelief flashing before discipline caught up, and for a moment Michael saw himself reflected there, decades younger, staring at symbols he did not yet understand, but already feared. The SEAL said nothing at first, only straightened and took half a step back, as if the object itself had weight. Someone else noticed the reaction, then another, and the ripples spread quietly through the room. Whispers followed, careful and restrained but charged. Michael did not need to hear the words to know their shape. That beret was not supposed to be here. It belonged to a unit spoken of only in closed rooms, a team whose existence had been a rumor wrapped in redactions, a nightmare footnote in enemy briefings. He had kept it because throwing it away felt like erasing the men who never came home, because memory demanded an anchor even when it hurt to hold one. The young SEAL finally spoke, his voice respectful and uncertain. "Sir," he said, then hesitated, as if unsure which title applied. "That insignia, I've only seen it once, in training. They said the unit was disbanded." Michael nodded once. He did not correct the assumption. Disbanded was a gentler word than buried. Around them the medical staff continued working, but the cadence had changed. The K-9's handler, a quiet man with tired eyes, watched Michael with something like hope threaded through caution. Michael felt the old resistance rise inside him, the instinct to fade into the background, to become invisible again. Taxi driver, civilian, safe categories. But the beret had already undone that. He became acutely aware of Rex behind him, steady and present, not intervening, simply reinforcing the truth that Michael was not alone even when he wanted to be. The young SEAL glanced toward the injured dog, then back to Michael. "He's been reacting to everyone," he said, offering information rather than instruction. "It's like he recognizes threats that aren't there." Michael swallowed, his jaw tightening. He knew that state intimately, the way the mind kept fighting long after the war had moved on. "Or threats that used to be there," Michael replied, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. The SEAL considered this, then nodded slowly. Another officer approached, older, higher in rank, carrying authority like a second skin. His eyes went to the beret immediately, then to Michael's face, and something unreadable passed between them. No challenge followed, no demand for credentials. Instead, the officer inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement that bypassed protocol and spoke directly to shared history. Michael felt a flicker of something close to anger then, not at the man, but at the ease with which the past resurfaced when invited. He had spent years driving streets that did not know his name, building a life small enough to manage, and now a piece of cloth threatened to drag him back into a world of ghosts and unfinished duty. The injured K-9 shifted again, a low sound escaping its chest, softer than before. Michael's attention returned to the animal, to the controlled tension that mirrored his own. He felt the pull, the dangerous familiarity of responsibility, and fought it. He was tired. He had earned the right to be tired. Yet the room seemed to lean toward him, expectation pressing in like weather. The handler spoke quietly, almost to himself. "He lost his last handler 6 months ago. Since then, he hasn't settled. Tonight was the worst." The words landed with precision. Loss. Unresolved. Michael's chest tightened, images flickering unbidden, faces without graves, names spoken once and never again. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, meeting the dog's gaze. The animal did not flinch. It waited. The officer cleared his throat. "We weren't expecting outside involvement," he said carefully. Michael understood the invitation hidden in the phrasing, the way institutions protect themselves by pretending choice exists. He adjusted the beret unconsciously, feeling the worn fabric beneath his fingers. "Neither was I," he answered. The truth sat between them, heavy and unavoidable. The young SEAL watched this exchange with open fascination, witnessing something that training manuals could not explain. Michael felt a strange detachment settle over him, the calm that arrived before hard decisions. He did not know yet what he would do, only that leaving now would follow him home, would ride silently in the back seat of his taxi until it demanded attention. The K-9 let out a low breath, almost a sigh, and Michael had the unsettling sense that something had already been decided, not by rank or protocol, but by recognition. As the officer gestured for him to step closer, Michael hesitated for the briefest moment, aware that crossing that distance would close one door and open another. He had spent years trying not to see. He moved anyway, and somewhere deep inside, the past stirred, preparing to speak. Cold fluorescent light washes over the medical bay as snow presses silently against the reinforced walls, and time narrows to breath, pulse, and the fragile space between trust and collapse. Michael Carter felt the moment before it happened, the way he had always felt, the half-second before a door blew inward or a convoy veered off script, when instinct rose faster than thought and the body answered questions the mind was still forming. The room had gone quiet, in a way that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with anticipation, as if every person present sensed that the next decision would not belong to policy or rank. The injured K9 remained braced near the wall, breathing shallow, eyes tracking not faces but angles, vectors, possibilities. A living map of threat assessment etched into muscle memory. Michael understood that map. He had carried it himself long after he stopped wearing a uniform. He took one step forward, slow enough to be non-threatening, deliberate enough to signal intention, and felt Rex behind him shift his weight almost imperceptibly, not following, not retreating, simply anchoring Michael to the present. Someone inhaled sharply. No one spoke. Michael's thoughts crowded in despite his effort to keep them at bay. He was aware of his age, of the stiffness in his joints, of the absurdity of a taxi driver standing inside a military medical facility as if he belonged there. He was also aware of the familiar tightening in his chest, the old internal argument resurfacing with practiced cruelty. You walked away. You earned that. This is not yours anymore. The counter-argument arrived just as reliably. You never stopped being this. You just stopped being called by its name. He focused on the dog instead, on the controlled violence coiled beneath the surface, on the way fear and discipline were fighting for dominance inside a body trained to obey even while bleeding. The K9's eyes flicked briefly to Rex, then back to Michael, a silent exchange that bypassed language entirely. Recognition, not of friendship, but of shared function. Michael lowered himself carefully, bending at the knees rather than the waist, making his silhouette smaller without making it weak. He remembered a briefing from years ago, a footnote delivered by a handler whose hands shook slightly as he spoke. Dogs don't read your face, he'd said. They read what lives underneath it. Michael felt that truth settle into his bones now. He extended one hand, palm angled down, fingers loose, stopping well short of contact. The dog did not lunge. It did not retreat. Its breathing hitched once, then steadied. Michael waited. He had learned patience the hard way, in places where impatience got people killed. Around them, the room held its breath. The young SEAL watched with open tension, torn between training that demanded control and instinct that recognized something rare unfolding. The senior officer's expression was unreadable, but his hands had stilled at his sides. Michael closed the remaining distance slowly, aware of every inch, every shift of air. When his hand finally made contact, it was exactly where muscle memory guided it, resting at the base of the dog's neck where tension gathered, where pressure could ground without restraining. The reaction was immediate and profound. The K9 stiffened, then shuddered, a full-body tremor that rippled through muscle and bone before easing. The growl that had lived in its chest dissolved into a low, uncertain sound, not submission, not defeat, but something closer to grief. Michael kept his hand steady, resisting the urge to stroke or soothe in ways that might read as false. He let his presence do the work. He felt the dog's heartbeat under his palm, fast but no longer erratic, and recognized the moment for what it was. A recalibration, a decision made at a level deeper than fear. Michael's own internal noise surged in response. The contact triggered memories he had worked hard to compartmentalize. Nights crouched behind cover, with a hand pressed to a teammate's shoulder, feeling life thrum under skin while the world burned. The weight of responsibility when someone else's survival hinged on his ability to stay calm. His breath shortened. For a moment, the medical bay blurred at the edges, replaced by the metallic taste of adrenaline and smoke. He grounded himself the way he always did, naming what was real. Tile floor, cold air, Rex breathing behind him, a living animal trusting him not to break this fragile truce. The dog leaned a fraction closer, not seeking comfort so much as confirmation. Michael adjusted his hand minutely, a silent acknowledgement. A murmur passed through the observers, quickly stifled. The handler's eyes shone with something like relief. "He's never let anyone do that," he said quietly. "Not as a warning, but as a confession." Michael didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could without breaking the spell. He felt the dog's awareness widen, senses shifting from pure defense to cautious engagement, and understood that this was the threshold moment trainers talked about but rarely witnessed. Trust not given, but negotiated. The senior officer stepped closer, careful now, his voice low. "What are you doing?" he asked, not accusatory, genuinely uncertain. Michael considered the question. He could have answered with jargon, with doctrine, with stories that justified his presence. Instead, he spoke the simplest truth he had. "I'm staying," he said. The word landed heavier than he expected. Staying was not neutral. Staying meant responsibility. Staying meant that if this went wrong, he would carry it with him. Another weight added to a ledger already crowded with names and moments he could not forget. The K9 shifted again, testing its injured leg, a flash of pain tightening its body before it settled once more. Michael felt a surge of anger then, sharp and focused, not at the dog, but at the unseen cause of its suffering. Training accidents happened, he knew that. But something about the animal's response felt wrong, too specific, too haunted by anticipation. The thought lodged itself quietly, an unanswered question waiting its turn. Michael became aware of Rex moving closer, stopping just at the edge of the space Michael had claimed. Rex did not intervene. He did not challenge. He simply bore witness, his presence reinforcing the unspoken bond forming in the center of the room. The injured dog's attention flicked to Rex again, then returned to Michael, as if triangulating safety through familiar patterns. Michael felt the weight of leadership settle onto him without ceremony. Not command, responsibility, the kind that arrived whether you invited it or not. Time stretched. The medical staff resumed their tasks slowly, carefully, guided by the new reality rather than forcing it to bend. Michael kept his hand where it was. His focus narrowed to the steadying rhythm beneath his palm. He did not yet know how deep this would go, what truths it might uncover, or how much it would cost him to follow it through. He only knew that something had shifted, and that once shifted, it could not be undone. As the dog's breathing evened and its eyes finally blinked, lingering on Michael's face with something dangerously close to recognition, Michael felt a quiet certainty take hold. This was not the end of the escalation. It was the beginning of a deeper unraveling, one that would demand answers the facility was not prepared to give. The medical bay feels smaller now, sealed by winter walls and quiet minds, as snow presses harder outside and the night settles into a watchful stillness. The room had crossed a threshold Michael Carter recognized too well, the point where noise gave way not to calm but to attention, where every movement carried meaning because meaning could no longer be ignored. His hand remained steady at the base of the K9's neck, not gripping, not soothing, simply present, an anchor offered without demand. The dog's breathing had slowed enough to be counted, each rise and fall measured like a perimeter check, and Michael found himself matching it unconsciously, syncing his own breath to the rhythm of another being who had learned, as he had, that control was the difference between survival and collapse. Around them, the medical staff resumed their work with deliberate care, instruments lifted and set down, with new respect for the fragile balance that had formed. No one rushed. No one raised their voice. The handler knelt nearby, eyes never leaving the dog, as if afraid that looking away might shatter the moment. Michael became aware of the weight of memory pressing closer as the procedure began. The smell of antiseptic mixed with blood pulled at something buried deep, and for a moment he was not standing in a medical bay, but crouched in a place where the ground shook and the air burned, where voices came through static and orders were followed because hesitation meant death. He forced himself back to the present, grounding in the pressure beneath his palm, in the knowledge that this time, staying calm, might save more than just one life. The veterinarian spoke quietly, narrating steps for the benefit of the room, and Michael noticed how the dog responded not to the words, but to tone, to the absence of threat carried in the cadence. He felt a familiar urge rise, the instinct to explain, to contextualize what was happening in terms others could understand. But he resisted it. Explanations could wait. Trust could not. Someone asked him softly if he had worked with dogs before. Michael hesitated, then answered honestly, without embellishment. "I worked with teams," he said. "Dogs were part of that. It was enough." The young SEAL watched him closely, absorbing each word like a lesson not found in manuals. As the wound was cleaned more thoroughly, the dog flinched, a sharp intake of breath, betraying pain it had been holding back. Michael adjusted his hand slightly, applying pressure where instinct told him it would ground rather than provoke. He spoke then, not loudly, not formally, but with the same low, even cadence he had once used over radios when chaos threatened to break through discipline. He spoke of holding lines when everything screamed to run, of waiting in darkness so complete it erased time, of moments when survival hinged not on strength, but on the ability to remain present, while fear clawed for control. He did not name places. He did not name people. Yet the room listened as if he had. The handler swallowed hard. The senior officer shifted his stance, the rigid set of his shoulders easing almost imperceptibly. Michael felt the dog's muscles relax in increments, as if each word peeled away another layer of vigilance. He spoke of a teammate once, a man whose name had never appeared in any report, who had held a position long enough for others to escape and never stood up again. The memory tightened Michael's throat, but he did not stop. He let the silence after the story stretch, honoring the weight of what had been given without turning it into spectacle. The dog let out a low sound, not a growl this time, but something that resonated like recognition, and Michael felt a flicker of something dangerously close to relief pass through the room. It was during this quiet that the veterinarian paused, brow furrowing as fingers traced deeper into the wound. The rhythm of the room shifted instantly. Michael felt it before anyone spoke, the subtle tightening that meant something was wrong. The vet asked for better light. Tools were adjusted. A metallic glint appeared briefly before being obscured by gloved hands. "That's not supposed to be there," the vet murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Michael's focus sharpened. He had seen enough injuries to know the difference between debris and intent. The object was small, irregular, embedded in a way that suggested trajectory rather than accident. The handler leaned in, confusion etched across his face. "Training accident," he said weakly, as if repeating the phrase might make it true. Michael felt anger bloom, controlled but intense, the kind that clarified rather than consumed. He kept his voice low. "How long has he been reacting like this?" he asked. The handler hesitated. "Since the incident," he admitted, "since before tonight." The pieces began to align in Michael's mind, not as certainty but as suspicion, and suspicion was enough to change everything. The dog stiffened briefly as the fragment was removed, pain flashing through its system, then settled again, leaning subtly into Michael's hand as if choosing that contact over panic. Michael understood the significance of that choice, the way the animal trusted him not to betray the fragile alliance they had formed. The room was very quiet now, not reverent, focused. The senior officer's gaze moved from the extracted fragment to Michael, calculation evident. No accusations were made, no conclusions drawn, but something fundamental had shifted. Michael felt it settle into his chest, heavy and unavoidable. This was no longer about calming a wounded K9. It was about what had happened here, unseen and unspoken, and why an animal trained to trust its environment had instead learned to anticipate harm from within it. He felt Rex move closer, a silent presence reinforcing his resolve, and for the first time since entering the facility, Michael allowed himself to consider that this path might not end with the dog healed and him returning to his taxi. As the wound was stabilized and the dog's breathing evened further, the veterinarian confirmed what Michael already suspected aloud. "This wasn't just bad luck," he said quietly. No one argued. Michael met the dog's eyes again, seeing there not just pain, but a lingering alertness, a refusal to fully stand down. The dog had been right to be afraid. Michael felt a grim sense of validation mix with dread. He had stepped into this because he could not ignore a cry that sounded too much like his own. Now he was standing at the edge of something darker, something that would demand more than presence and calm. As the room prepared to move the dog for recovery, Michael kept his hand in place a moment longer, a silent promise forming without words. Whatever had wounded this animal had not finished its work, and neither, it seemed, had he. Dawn creeps pale and cold across the training compound. Snow hardened into dull crystal as the night finally loosens its grip on fences, buildings, and the people who stayed awake too long. By the time the first gray light seeped through the reinforced windows, the medical bay no longer felt like a battlefield outpost, but like a room recovering from one. Michael Carter stayed where he was, hand resting lightly where it had been for hours, feeling the injured K9 breathe with a steadiness that had not existed before the fragment was removed. The dog was not asleep in the way civilians slept. It was resting with one part of itself still alert, still listening for danger, a posture Michael recognized with painful clarity. Around them, the staff moved with a subdued efficiency that spoke less of routine and more of aftermath. No one rushed Michael anymore. No one questioned his presence. Something unspoken had settled into place, an understanding that whatever line had been crossed could not be uncrossed. The senior officer returned with another man Michael had not seen before, introduced only as internal security, his role evident from the way questions were asked softly but left no room for evasion. The fragment lay sealed in a sterile tray, small and damning, and Michael felt the weight of it without touching it again. He listened as timelines were reconstructed, as logs were compared, as quiet inconsistencies surfaced and clustered around one name belonging to a contractor assigned to maintenance and supply oversight. A man whose past included a brief discharge from another base after an investigation that had gone nowhere. Michael did not involve himself directly, but he paid attention, the old habit of pattern recognition waking fully now. He noticed the way the injured K9 reacted whenever that name was spoken, a subtle tightening, a shift toward guarded readiness that had nothing to do with pain. That was enough. Rex was brought closer when asked not as an afterthought, but as a resource, and Michael felt a familiar mix of pride and unease at the trust implied. He gave no commands, only allowed Rex to do what Rex had always done best, observe without assumption, sort truth from noise. Rex moved through the adjacent corridors with quiet purpose, nose following traces humans overlooked, memory guiding instinct through a landscape of recent deceit. The internal security officer watched closely, not interfering, understanding perhaps that some investigations required senses shaped by different wars. It did not take long. Rex stopped near a storage area rarely used at night, posture changing subtly, certainty replacing curiosity. The discovery that followed unfolded without drama, but with finality, concealed packets hidden behind panels, records altered with clumsy precision, evidence of illicit storage, and intent to remove rather than report. When confronted, the contractor's composure fractured quickly, the story collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Michael stood apart as the man was taken away, not feeling satisfaction, only a heavy confirmation that the K9's fear had been justified, that trust had been violated from within the perimeter meant to protect. The injured dog sensed the shift before anyone explained it, tension easing in a way that spoke of danger, finally moving away rather than being subdued. Michael felt it under his hand, the slow release of vigilance that came only when the mind accepted that the immediate threat was gone. The veterinarian confirmed that recovery would be complete with time, that the damage had been caught before it could become permanent. The handler's relief was visible but restrained, professionalism containing emotion that threatened to spill over. Michael stepped back then, finally, removing his hand with care, feeling the strange ache of separation even as he knew it was necessary. The dog watched him go, not with desperation, but with something like acknowledgment, a bond forged under pressure and now settling into memory. Outside, the compound stirred awake, night crews giving way to day personnel, unaware of how close the facility had come to a quieter kind of catastrophe. Michael retrieved his jacket, adjusted the beret without thinking, then paused, fingers lingering on the worn fabric. For the first time in years, he considered leaving it behind, allowing the symbol to rest where it belonged, among people who understood its cost. He decided against it. Some things were meant to travel until they found their final place. Rex waited at his side, calm and complete, mission finished without ceremony. As Michael walked back toward his taxi, the cold air biting but honest, he felt the familiar pull of exhaustion layered with something new, something lighter. He had not planned to intervene, had not wanted to reopen doors sealed by time and trauma, yet the night had demanded otherwise, and he had answered. The dog would heal. The truth had surfaced. The compound would adjust and move on. Michael started the engine and listened to it settle into a steady hum, a sound that anchored him to the present. He drove away as the sun rose fully, snow reflecting light instead of swallowing it, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that while the war had ended long ago, the watch sometimes resumed without warning, and that answering it once had been enough. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder from the sky or light breaking through the clouds. Sometimes the miracle is quieter. It is a man who chooses to stop instead of walking away, a voice that speaks calmly when fear is screaming, a loyal heart that refuses to give up even after betrayal and pain. God does not always remove the darkness immediately. Often, God sends presence instead. He sends courage in ordinary clothes. He sends help through hands that are willing to stay. And in those moments, healing begins, not just for the wounded, but for everyone who witnesses it. In our daily lives, we may never step into a battlefield or a guarded compound, but we face our own quiet wars every day: fear, loneliness, exhaustion, loss. This story reminds us that faith is not always about grand gestures. Sometimes faith is simply choosing to care when it would be easier to look away. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story made you feel or where you are watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories of courage, loyalty, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and walk beside you through every season of your life. And may you never forget, even in the coldest night, you are never alone.